What if a small percentage of people alive today carry a blood type so unusual that it has inspired theories about lost civilizations, forgotten ancestors, and mysteries stretching back thousands of years? Rh-negative blood is real. Scientists can measure it, doctors study it. Yet for decades, people have connected it to Atlantis, ancient kingdoms, and hidden chapters of human history that seem to exist just beyond the reach of evidence. Is Rh-negative blood simply a rare genetic trait? Or could it be a surviving clue from humanity's distant and largely forgotten past? Before we go deeper into this mystery, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy ancient history, lost civilizations, and the mysteries that still challenge everything we think we know. Tonight, we follow the evidence through genetics, archaeology, myth, and prehistory to uncover one of the most fascinating mysteries ever linked to the human bloodline. The mystery begins with something invisible. No ruined city rises from the desert. No forgotten temple emerges from a jungle canopy. No ancient manuscript is discovered in a sealed cave. Instead, the clue exists inside the human body itself, flowing silently through veins and arteries, carried from one generation to the next. Most people never think about it until they donate blood, undergo surgery, or see a medical chart listing a few simple letters beside their name. A positive, O positive, B positive, AB positive. Ordinary details in modern medicine. Yet hidden among those familiar labels is a small minority of people whose blood lacks a particular marker found in most of humanity. They are Rh-negative. For decades, this rare biological trait has inspired questions that extend far beyond medicine. It has appeared in books about lost civilizations, documentaries about forgotten peoples, and countless theories attempting to explain unusual chapters of human history. Some have claimed Rh-negative blood is evidence of an ancient lineage that vanished long ago. Others have connected it to legendary civilizations swallowed by catastrophe. Still others have proposed origins so extraordinary that mainstream science rejects them outright. What makes the mystery endure is not merely the existence of Rh-negative blood itself. Biology offers explanations for many unusual genetic traits. The fascination comes from something else. It comes from the strange gap between what is known and what remains uncertain. It comes from the fact that a genuine scientific phenomenon became intertwined with stories about humanity's deepest past. The result is a puzzle that sits at the crossroads of genetics, archaeology, migration, mythology, and imagination. Imagine standing on a windswept coastline thousands of years ago. The sea stretches toward the horizon. Small communities survive by fishing, hunting, and trading with distant neighbors. Generations live and die in relative isolation. Their descendants inherit languages, customs, physical features, and genetic traits shaped by countless centuries of survival. Most traces of those people eventually disappear. Their homes decay. Their tools break apart. Their names vanish from memory, but fragments of their genetic heritage continue traveling through time inside living descendants. Modern science increasingly reveals that the past is not entirely buried beneath soil and stone. Some of it survives within us. Every human carries a record of ancient journeys. DNA contains echoes of migrations that crossed continents, survived climate disasters, endured population collapses, and adapted to unfamiliar worlds. Although genes cannot tell us everything about history, they often preserve clues long after written records disappear. Rh-negative blood belongs to that category of clues. At first glance, it seems deceptively simple. The majority of people possess a protein known as the Rh factor, on the surface of their red blood cells. Those individuals are classified as Rh positive. Others lack that factor and are classified as Rh negative. Nothing about this distinction appears especially mysterious from a medical perspective. Many genetic variations exist throughout humanity. Some are common, some are rare, some are concentrated within specific populations. Yet Rh-negative blood occupies a peculiar place in public imagination because its distribution is uneven. In some populations, it remains relatively uncommon. In others, it appears at significantly higher frequencies. Why? That question opened a door that many people were eager to walk through. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Long before modern genetics existed, people searched for explanations regarding human differences. They created stories about ancestors, founders, gods, heroes, and lost worlds. Across cultures, unusual traits often acquired symbolic meaning, distinctive appearances, uncommon abilities, or rare characteristics sometimes became signs of special ancestry. The modern era did not eliminate this tendency. Instead, science occasionally provided new material for old impulses. When people learned that some individuals carried Rh-negative blood while most did not, curiosity naturally followed. Once researchers discovered that the trait appeared more frequently in certain regions, curiosity expanded into speculation. Could Rh-negative blood represent a surviving remnant of an ancient people? Could it preserve traces of populations that disappeared from history? Could forgotten migrations explain its presence? Or was it simply a normal genetic variation whose mystery had been exaggerated over time? The evidence supports some possibilities far more strongly than others. Still, the story became larger than the biology itself. Throughout the 20th century, discussions about Rh-negative blood increasingly escaped the boundaries of medical journals. Alternative histories began incorporating it into narratives about Atlantis, vanished civilizations, hidden bloodlines, and prehistoric survivors. Theories multiplied because the subject occupied a unique position. It was real enough to be scientifically interesting, yet unfamiliar enough to appear mysterious. This combination is remarkably powerful. Human beings are naturally drawn toward unresolved questions. A trait affecting only a minority of the population immediately attracts attention. Add incomplete historical records, ancient legends, and genuine gaps in knowledge, and the result becomes fertile ground for speculation. What often gets lost amid these debates is the extraordinary reality already revealed by science. The true history of humanity is astonishing even without mythical explanations. Over the last several 100,000 years, our species endured dramatic climate shifts. Vast ice sheets advanced and retreated across continents. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath oceans. Deserts transformed into grasslands and then returned to desert once again. Small bands of humans migrated across immense distances, entering regions their ancestors had never seen. Many populations vanished. Some left descendants. Others disappeared entirely. The genetic landscape of the modern world emerged from countless encounters, separations, bottlenecks, and migrations. Within that immense process, unusual traits could become concentrated in certain groups for reasons that have nothing to do with lost supercivilizations or secret origins. Isolation alone can sometimes amplify rare genetic characteristics. Population bottlenecks can reshape entire genetic profiles. Founder effects can allow uncommon traits to become surprisingly common within particular communities. Scholars still debate aspects of these processes because the evidence remains incomplete. Ancient DNA studies continue uncovering new information every year. Human history grows more complex the deeper researchers look. This uncertainty matters, not because it proves extraordinary claims, but because genuine mysteries still exist. The public often imagines science as a collection of final answers. In reality, science frequently reveals new questions. Each discovery illuminates some parts of the picture while exposing additional gaps. Raw negative blood sits precisely within that space. Researchers understand much more about it today than they did decades ago. The underlying genetics are increasingly clear. The biological mechanisms are better understood. Yet the broader story intersects with migrations and population histories that stretch deep into prehistory. And prehistory remains a landscape filled with shadows. The farther back we travel, the fewer records survive. Languages disappear. Cultures vanish. Coastlines change. Entire communities leave behind little more than scattered artifacts. Sometimes only fragments remain. A stone tool, a burial site, a genetic marker passed through generations. The fascination surrounding Rh negative blood emerges from this collision between modern biology and ancient uncertainty. It is a story that begins inside the bloodstream, but quickly expands outward into forgotten migrations, isolated populations, legendary civilizations, and humanity's enduring desire to discover where we came from. Some of the theories that emerge from this mystery will prove unsupported. Others will contain small pieces of truth hidden within larger misunderstandings. Many questions will lead not toward lost civilizations, but towards something equally remarkable, the complicated and often surprising history of real human populations. As the story unfolds, the line between evidence and speculation becomes increasingly important. The challenge is not simply determining what people believe, it is understanding why they believe it, and what the actual record can tell us about one of the most intriguing biological mysteries ever woven into humanity's search for its own origins. The journey begins with the scientific discovery that transformed medicine and unexpectedly launched one of the modern world's most persistent historical enigmas. The story takes a decisive turn in the early 20th century, not in an archaeological excavation or a forgotten archive, but inside laboratories where scientists are attempting to solve one of medicine's most dangerous problems. For centuries, blood transfusions were unpredictable. Some patients survived and recovered. Others suffered severe reactions that physicians struggled to explain. The breakthrough came when researchers discovered that human blood was not all the same. Different blood groups existed, and compatibility mattered. What had once appeared random began revealing an underlying biological logic. The identification of the ABO blood groups revolutionized medicine. Yet even after that discovery, certain transfusion reactions continued to occur. Some patients still experienced dangerous complications despite apparently receiving compatible blood. Something else remained hidden. The search for that missing factor eventually led scientists toward one of the most important findings in modern hematology. In 1940, researchers identified what became known as the Rh factor. The name originated from experiments involving rhesus monkeys, although later research would reveal a more complex biological reality than initially understood. What mattered most was the discovery that another major blood group system existed beyond ABO. People possessing the Rh factor were classified as Rh positive. People lacking it were classified as Rh negative. Suddenly, many previously mysterious medical complications made sense. The finding represented a triumph of scientific investigation, yet it also introduced a new puzzle. Once researchers began examining populations around the world, they noticed that Rh negative blood was not distributed evenly. Most human beings are Rh positive. In many regions, Rh negative individuals represent only a small percentage of the population. In parts of Asia and Africa, frequencies can be particularly low, yet in portions of Europe, especially Western Europe, negative blood appears far more commonly. The numbers varied significantly from one population to another. At first, this seemed like a straightforward observation. Human populations differ genetically in many ways. Such variation is normal, but the uneven distribution attracted attention because it hinted at historical processes operating far beyond modern medicine. Why would one region contain substantially higher frequencies than another? What ancient events shaped these patterns? The answers likely stretched back thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands. As population genetics developed throughout the 20th century, researchers increasingly recognized that genes could function as historical clues. They could not provide complete narratives, but they could reveal traces of migrations, isolations, expansions, and bottlenecks that occurred long before written records existed. A genetic marker found frequently in one region and rarely in another often reflected some deeper historical process. The challenge was determining which process. Human populations rarely remain stationary. Communities migrate, empires expand, trade networks connect distant regions, climate changes force movement, wars reshape demographics. Over long periods, genetic landscapes become extraordinarily complicated. What survives in the record suggests that Europe experienced repeated waves of migration throughout prehistory. Hunter-gatherers occupied the continent long before farming arrived. Later, agricultural communities spread from the Near East. Still later, migrations from the Eurasian steppe transformed the genetic makeup of many regions. Each wave left descendants. Each wave contributed to the genetic mixture visible today. Against that backdrop, Rh-negative blood became part of a much larger story involving population history rather than isolated biology. Yet outside scientific circles, the mystery began taking on a life of its own. One reason was that Rh-negative blood appeared genuinely unusual. Most people belong to the majority category. Anything uncommon naturally attracts curiosity. Another reason involved a specific medical complication known as Rh incompatibility. If an Rh-negative mother carries an Rh-positive child, biological complications can potentially arise. Modern medicine now manages these situations effectively in most cases. Before those interventions existed, however, such incompatibilities sometimes created serious risks. For many observers unfamiliar with the underlying biology, this phenomenon seemed strange. Why would human bodies react this way? The question sounds simple, but it became fertile ground for speculation. Some writers suggested that Rh-negative individuals represented remnants of an entirely separate ancestral group. Others proposed connections to lost civilizations. A few advanced even more extraordinary theories involving non-human origins. These claims gained attention because they appeared to offer dramatic explanations for a real biological phenomenon. The problem was that dramatic explanations are not necessarily correct explanations. Modern genetics provides strong evidence that Rh-negative blood results from ordinary evolutionary and hereditary processes. Specific genetic variations affecting the Rh factor have been identified and studied extensively. Researchers understand far more about the underlying mechanisms than early theorists did. Yet understanding a mechanism does not automatically explain its historical distribution. That distinction is important. Scientists can identify the genetic basis of a trait while still investigating how historical events influenced its frequency across populations. Those are related questions, but they are not identical. Imagine a rare characteristic emerging within an ancient community. If that community remains isolated for long periods, the characteristic may become relatively common among descendants. If descendants later migrate, the trait can spread into new regions. If populations experience bottlenecks, frequencies may change dramatically. No mysterious civilization is required. Human history alone can produce surprisingly complex patterns. The deeper researchers looked into ancient populations, the clearer this principle became. Throughout history, groups often lived in environments that limited outside contact. Mountain valleys, islands, remote coastlines, and rugged highlands sometimes created natural barriers to movement. Communities could remain relatively isolated for generations. Under such conditions, unusual genetic traits occasionally became more concentrated than they would in larger, more interconnected populations. This process appears repeatedly throughout human history. Certain hereditary conditions occur frequently in specific populations. Distinctive genetic markers sometimes cluster within particular regions. These patterns do not necessarily indicate exotic origins. Often they reflect the mathematics of inheritance operating over long periods. Yet the public fascination surrounding Rh-negative blood continued growing. Part of the appeal lay in timing. The mid-20th century witnessed enormous interest in ancient mysteries. Archaeological discoveries were reshaping understanding of the past. Ancient civilizations were becoming household subjects through books, magazines, documentaries, and popular culture. Stories about Atlantis, forgotten continents, and vanished peoples captured widespread imagination. Into this environment entered a genuine scientific curiosity. A minority blood type, uneven distribution, incomplete historical records, ancestral questions stretching deep into prehistory. The ingredients were perfect. Theories flourished. Some claimed connections to survivors of ancient catastrophes. Others suggested hidden lineages descending from long-lost civilizations. A few argued that Rh-negative blood represented evidence of forgotten branches of humanity, entirely separate from known populations. Most of these ideas lacked supporting evidence. Nevertheless, they persisted because they addressed a powerful human desire, the desire to uncover hidden origins. The reality emerging from scientific research proved less sensational, but no less fascinating. Rather than pointing towards secret civilizations, the evidence increasingly suggested a story shaped by migration, isolation, inheritance, and survival. In many ways, that story is more remarkable. It means that the mystery may not belong to a lost kingdom buried beneath the sea. It may belong to ordinary communities navigating extraordinary circumstances across thousands of years. Small groups surviving climate upheavals, families crossing unfamiliar landscapes, populations enduring bottlenecks that altered their genetic futures. The clues are scattered across continents. Some lie within modern populations. Others remain buried in ancient graves, waiting for DNA analysis to reveal forgotten connections. As researchers continued mapping the distribution of Rh-negative blood, one region repeatedly drew attention. Along the Atlantic edge of Europe lived a people whose language seemed unlike any surrounding tongue, whose history stretched deep into antiquity, and whose rates of Rh-negative blood were among the highest ever recorded. Their story would become central to nearly every discussion surrounding the mystery, and before long, they would find themselves linked not only to genetics, but also to some of the oldest and most enduring legends in human history. The map of Rh-negative blood does not spread evenly across the world. Instead, it forms a pattern that immediately attracts attention. Large portions of humanity possess the Rh-positive factor, While Rh negative frequencies fluctuate dramatically from region to region, to scientists, such variation is a clue. To mystery writers and alternative historians, it became an invitation. As researchers gathered more data throughout the 20th century, one fact stood out. The highest concentrations of Rh-negative blood were generally found in parts of Western Europe. This was not entirely unexpected. Human populations often exhibit regional genetic differences, yet the numbers were striking enough to generate discussion. In some communities, Rh-negative frequencies reached levels far above the global average. Why Western Europe? Why not elsewhere? The question became even more intriguing when examined against the backdrop of human prehistory. For most of human existence, Europe was not the densely populated continent it would later become. During the height of the Ice Age, enormous glaciers covered vast northern regions. Conditions fluctuated dramatically as temperatures rose and fell over thousands of years. Entire ecosystems expanded and contracted. Rivers changed course. Coastlines shifted. Human populations repeatedly adapted to environmental instability. The Europe we know today emerged from these transformations. Imagine Western Europe 20,000 years ago. Much of the continent feels colder and harsher than the landscapes familiar today. Mammoths still roam certain regions. Reindeer herds move across open plains. Human groups survive through hunting, gathering, and careful knowledge of seasonal cycles. Populations remain relatively small compared to later agricultural societies. These communities are not isolated from history. They are history. Their descendants will eventually contribute to the genetic foundations of future European populations. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that Ice Age Europe contained a patchwork of human groups whose fortunes rose and fell alongside changing climates. Some populations disappeared, others expanded, some retreated into environmental refuges where survival remained possible even during the coldest periods. These refuges would become extraordinarily important. During glacial maxima, regions of southern Europe offered comparatively favourable conditions. Areas within the Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy, and portions of the Balkans acted as havens where human populations could persist, while harsher conditions dominated elsewhere. When the climate later improved, descendants of these survivors expanded outward. This process alone had enormous genetic consequences. If a relatively small population survives a bottleneck and later contributes disproportionately to future generations, certain genetic traits can become more common than they were previously. The phenomenon is well understood within population genetics. No mystery civilization is required. No hidden continent needs to sink beneath the sea. Simple demographic processes operating over thousands of years can reshape the genetic landscape of entire regions. Yet these explanations only became fully visible through decades of research. Earlier observers confronted the patterns without possessing modern genetic tools. Consequently, alternative interpretations flourished. The situation became even more complicated because Europe contains numerous examples of cultural and linguistic diversity that seem unusual when viewed from a modern perspective. Languages survive that appear disconnected from neighbouring language families. Ancient traditions persist in isolated regions. Archaeological discoveries reveal migrations and population replacements that were invisible to previous generations of scholars. The deeper researchers investigated Europe's past, the more complex it became. Rather than a single continuous civilization, Europe emerged as a tapestry woven from many different peoples arriving at different times. Hunter-gatherers occupied the continent long before agriculture. Farmers migrated from Anatolia and the Near East, bringing new technologies and ways of life. Pastoral groups from the Eurasian steppe later contributed additional ancestry across large portions of the continent. Each movement altered the population structure. Each migration left traces within modern DNA. Within this vast historical mosaic, Rh-negative blood became one thread among many. Scientists increasingly approach the subject through the lens of population history. Instead of asking whether Rh-negative individuals represented a separate human lineage, researchers examined how normal evolutionary processes could explain observed frequencies. Natural selection may have played some role. Genetic drift almost certainly played a role. Founder effects likely influenced certain populations. Isolation mattered. Migration mattered. Chance mattered. The evidence remains incomplete in some areas, but mainstream genetics consistently points toward these mechanisms rather than extraordinary origins. Even so, a deeper question lingered. If Rh-negative blood is simply a genetic variation, why does it seem to attract such intense fascination compared to countless other hereditary traits? Part of the answer lies in human psychology. People are storytellers by nature. When confronted with unusual patterns, the mind searches for narratives capable of explaining them. The more unusual the pattern appears, the stronger the temptation to construct dramatic explanations. A rare blood type distributed unevenly across ancient populations feels like the beginning of a mystery novel. A statistical outcome of population genetics feels less exciting. Yet reality often operates through statistical outcomes. Ancient history repeatedly demonstrates this principle. Many developments that seem extraordinary emerge from ordinary processes acting over immense spans of time. Tiny advantages accumulate. Small populations survive against improbable odds. Geographic isolation amplifies differences generation after generation. Over centuries and millennia, subtle forces produce dramatic results. One of the most revealing examples comes from islands. Island populations frequently develop unusual characteristics because isolation restricts gene flow. Certain traits become common while others disappear entirely. Similar effects can occur in mountain valleys, remote coastal regions, and other relatively isolated environments. Western Europe contains several such regions. Over thousands of years, these landscapes helped shape distinctive population histories. As researchers examined Rh-negative frequencies more carefully, attention increasingly focused on communities whose histories appeared unusually ancient. Some groups preserved cultural traditions stretching back far beyond recorded history. Others spoke languages with no obvious close relatives. Among these populations, one stood apart. Along the rugged northern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, between mountains and sea, lived a people whose language baffled linguists and whose ancestry became central to discussions about Rh-negative blood. The Basques. For generations, the Basque people occupied a unique place in European scholarship. Their language, Euskara, resisted classification. Unlike neighbouring languages derived from Indo-European roots, Euskara appeared unrelated to almost every major language family surrounding it. This linguistic isolation inspired countless theories. Were the Basques descendants of Europe's earliest inhabitants? Did they preserve remnants of a culture predating later migrations? Could their unusual characteristics provide a window into deep prehistory? When studies revealed relatively high frequencies of Rh-negative blood among Basque populations, the connection proved irresistible. Suddenly, genetics, language, and ancient history seemed to converge. To many observers, the pattern appeared too striking to ignore. A distinctive people, a unique language, an unusual blood type frequency. The ingredients for speculation multiplied rapidly. Before long, writers would begin linking the Basques to lost civilizations, vanished populations, and some of the most famous legends ever told. Entire books would emerge attempting to explain their origins through hidden histories and forgotten catastrophes. Yet the actual story proved far more complicated. The Basques were not relics frozen in time. They were not untouched survivors of a lost world. Like every population on Earth, they possessed a history shaped by migration, interaction, adaptation, and change. Still, scholars continue debating important aspects of that history. Ancient DNA studies have transformed understanding in recent years, but not every question has been answered. And therein lies the enduring attraction of the mystery. The evidence tells a remarkable story. The unanswered questions leave room for imagination. Somewhere between those two forces, between science and speculation, the Basque enigma emerged as one of the most important chapters in the larger puzzle of Rh-negative blood and humanity's forgotten past. Long before Rh-negative blood became a subject of scientific study, people were already searching for ancestors hidden beyond the edge of memory. Every civilization develops stories about origins. Some speak of heroic founders who arrived from distant lands. Others describe survivors emerging after great floods, wars, or divine catastrophes. Mountains become sacred because ancestors once crossed them. Islands become mysterious because nobody remembers who first settled them. Entire peoples construct identities from fragments of memory preserved across generations. Most of these traditions contain mixtures of history, symbolism, and imagination. Separating one from the other is rarely simple. As researchers began investigating the distribution of Rh-negative blood, many observers instinctively turned toward these older stories. If an unusual genetic trait appeared concentrated among certain populations, perhaps legends preserved clues about where those populations came from. The idea was appealing. Unfortunately, legends do not function like archaeological records. They change over time. Details are added, removed, and reshaped. Historical events merge with mythological themes. Real migrations can become stories about gods. Environmental disasters can become tales of cosmic punishment. Ancient memories often survive in distorted forms. Yet sometimes they preserve surprising fragments of truth. This possibility has fascinated historians for generations. Imagine standing in a prehistoric village several thousand years ago. There are no written records, no maps, no libraries. Knowledge survives through storytelling. Elders describe places nobody alive has ever seen. They speak of journeys undertaken by distant ancestors. They recount disasters that transformed landscapes and forced entire communities to move. Over centuries, those stories evolve. The names change. The details shift. The emotional core remains. Modern archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that some legendary traditions contain echoes of real events, not exact accounts, but distant reflections. Flood myths provide one example. Many cultures preserve stories involving overwhelming waters. For centuries, scholars debated whether these narratives reflected shared imagination or memories of genuine environmental changes. The answer appears complicated. Some stories may be purely symbolic. Others may preserve distorted recollections of local flooding events, rising sea levels, or coastal transformations that occurred thousands of years ago. The evidence remains incomplete, but the possibility is taken seriously. This realization encouraged some researchers and writers to wonder whether unusual genetic patterns might also connect to ancient population memories. If a community preserved traditions about arriving from elsewhere, could genetics help verify those stories? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it is no. Ancient DNA studies increasingly reveal that population histories are often far more complex than traditional legends suggest. Communities rarely descend from a single founder group. Instead, they emerge through repeated interactions among multiple populations. Migrations overlap. Cultural identities change. Genetic ancestry becomes layered over time. Nevertheless, the search for forgotten ancestors intensified throughout the 20th century. Particularly intriguing were populations whose origins appeared unusually obscure. The Basques attracted attention because of their language and Rh-negative frequencies, but they were not alone. Across Europe and the Near East, numerous communities possessed traditions describing migrations from distant lands. Ancient chroniclers wrote about mysterious seafaring peoples. Classical authors described tribes whose origins seemed uncertain, even in their own time. The farther scholars looked into antiquity, the more fragmented the picture became. Entire populations emerged briefly in historical records and then disappeared. Some were absorbed into larger societies. Others migrated elsewhere. Many left behind only names. Archaeology occasionally recovers traces of these forgotten peoples. A burial site appears beneath a modern field. Ancient tools emerge from a cave. DNA survives inside human remains preserved for thousands of years. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Yet every answer often produces additional questions. One of the most important lessons from modern genetics is that ancestry does not follow neat boundaries. Ancient populations interacted constantly. Trade routes connected distant regions. Marriage networks crossed cultural lines. Even communities separated by geography rarely remained completely isolated forever. As a result, searching for a single original Rh-negative people becomes increasingly difficult. Human history simply does not work that way. Instead of one ancestral group spreading a unique blood type across the world, researchers find complex webs of inheritance shaped by countless generations. Still, complexity often struggles to compete with mystery. Popular books and documentaries frequently prefer dramatic narratives. A lost civilization makes a more compelling story than gradual genetic drift. A forgotten race captures attention more easily than population bottlenecks. Consequently, Rh-negative blood became linked to an expanding collection of historical mysteries. Some theories suggested descendants of vanished European cultures. Others propose connections to ancient peoples of the Near East. A few writers searched even farther afield, linking Rh-negative populations to legendary civilizations said to have disappeared entirely. The problem was that evidence rarely kept pace with speculation. Many claims relied on coincidence rather than data. A population with elevated Rh-negative frequencies would be identified. A local legend would be discovered. Similarities would be noted. Entire theories would then emerge despite the absence of supporting archaeological evidence. This pattern repeated again and again. Yet not all investigations were misguided. Some questions genuinely deserved attention. For example, why do certain populations preserve unusually distinctive characteristics over long periods? How much continuity exists between ancient communities and modern descendants? Can genetic evidence illuminate migrations that left few archaeological traces? These are legitimate scientific questions. Researchers continue exploring them today. Ancient DNA has transformed the field in remarkable ways. 20 years ago, many population histories remained largely speculative. Today, scientists can extract genetic information from human remains thousands of years old. Entire migrations once invisible to historians are becoming clearer. The results are often surprising. Populations assumed to be stable sometimes reveal dramatic ancestry shifts. Groups believed unrelated occasionally show deep connections. Historical narratives once accepted as fact are frequently revised. The past becomes both clearer and more complicated simultaneously. Rich negative blood exists within this broader evolution in understanding. The trait itself is only one small piece of a much larger genetic story, yet because it is visible within modern medicine, it serves as an accessible gateway into questions about ancestry and origins. People naturally wonder whether something unusual in the present might reveal something extraordinary about the past. Sometimes it does. More often, it reveals that the past was more interconnected than anyone imagined. Still, as researchers explored legends and migration histories, another theme repeatedly surfaced. Across Europe, the Mediterranean, and parts of the Near East, stories survived describing advanced peoples destroyed by catastrophe. These accounts varied enormously. Some spoke of floods, others described earthquakes, some told of islands swallowed by the sea. Most were clearly mythical. A few contained details that seemed strangely persistent, and among all such legends, none captured public imagination more powerfully than the story of a civilization said to have vanished beneath the ocean, a place remembered by a single name, Atlantis. Once that name entered discussions about Rh negative blood, the mystery would take on a life far beyond anything suggested by the scientific evidence alone. The road from Rh negative blood to Atlantis is surprisingly short, not because archaeology supports such a connection, and not because genetics points toward a lost island civilization hidden beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The connection emerged for a different reason. Both subjects occupy the same territory within the human imagination. They involve fragments of evidence, unanswered questions, vanished worlds, and the enduring hope that somewhere beneath history's missing pages lies a forgotten truth waiting to be uncovered. Once those elements appeared together, it was almost inevitable that people would begin linking them. To understand how this happened, it is necessary to step back more than 2,000 years. The story of Atlantis enters the historical record through the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In two dialogues, the philosopher describes a powerful island civilization that supposedly existed long before his own time. According to the narrative, Atlantis possessed wealth, influence, and advanced engineering. Then, following moral decline and divine punishment, the civilization was destroyed. Earthquakes and floods consumed the island, leaving nothing behind but memory. For centuries, most scholars viewed Atlantis as a philosophical allegory rather than literal history. The story functioned as a lesson, a warning about pride, a meditation on power and collapse. Yet the tale possessed remarkable staying power. Unlike many ancient myths, Atlantis never disappeared from public consciousness. Instead, each generation reimagined it according to contemporary interests. During the Age of Exploration, some searched for Atlantis across newly discovered oceans. In the 19th century, writers proposed that it represented the source of all major civilizations. By the 20th century, Atlantis had become one of the world's most famous lost worlds. The absence of evidence only increased its appeal. A civilization that cannot be found can be placed almost anywhere. A culture that leaves no confirmed remains can be given almost any characteristics. This flexibility allowed Atlantis to absorb countless theories. Ancient engineers, master navigators, a forgotten empire, a vanished continent, survivors scattered across the globe. The possibilities seemed endless. When Rh negative blood entered popular discussion, Atlantis enthusiasts quickly recognized an opportunity. If certain populations possessed an unusual genetic trait, perhaps they descended from Atlantean survivors. if regions with elevated Rh-negative frequencies also possessed ancient legends, perhaps those legends preserved memories of Atlantis itself. The logic appeared attractive. The evidence did not. Modern archaeology has uncovered enormous amounts of information about ancient civilizations throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Researchers have identified countless settlements, trade networks, and cultural interactions stretching back thousands of years. No credible archaeological evidence currently supports the existence of Atlantis as a lost global super-civilization. Scholars continue debating whether Plato's account was inspired by real events, symbolic storytelling, or fragments of older traditions. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Yet mainstream research does not support the claim that Atlantis served as the ancestral homeland of Rh-negative populations. Even so, the theory persisted. Part of its appeal came from genuine historical mysteries. Sea levels have risen dramatically since the end of the last ice age. Around 20,000 years ago, vast quantities of water remained trapped within glaciers. Coastlines looked very different from those of today. Large areas that are now submerged once stood above sea level. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath advancing oceans. Ancient river valleys flooded. Coastal plains vanished. Human communities living in those regions were forced to move. This is not speculation. It is established geological history. What remains uncertain is the extent to which these environmental changes influence later myths. Some scholars have suggested that rising seas may have contributed to flood traditions preserved across various cultures. The evidence remains incomplete, but the idea is plausible. Communities witnessing dramatic environmental transformation would likely remember such events for generations. The reality is fascinating enough without Atlantis. Imagine a settlement established near a fertile coastal plain. Families live there for centuries. Children grow up knowing specific landmarks, rivers, and hunting grounds. Then, generation after generation, the shoreline slowly advances inland. Land disappears, villages relocate, familiar places vanish beneath water. Eventually, descendants tell stories about drowned lands, not because an advanced civilization collapsed overnight, but because environmental change altered the world around them. This process occurred repeatedly in different regions after the Ice Age. Yet for many people, gradual transformation lacks the dramatic force of catastrophe. A lost continent swallowed in a single night feels more memorable than rising seas occurring over centuries. Consequently, Atlantis remained irresistible. By the late 20th century, numerous authors were connecting Rh-negative blood to hypothetical Atlantean descendants. Some claimed survivors carried distinctive genetic traits into Europe. Others suggested hidden lineages preserving ancient knowledge. A few proposed elaborate migration routes linking Atlantis to the Basques, Celtic populations, and other groups with elevated Rh-negative frequencies. These claims shared a common weakness. They relied heavily on association rather than evidence. A mystery was connected to another mystery. A legend was linked to a genetic pattern. Speculation filled the gaps. Scientific support remained absent. Nevertheless, the popularity of such theories reveals something important about human nature. People are not merely searching for explanations. They are searching for meaning. A rare blood type can feel ordinary when described as the product of inheritance and population history. It becomes extraordinary when connected to a vanished civilization. The emotional appeal is obvious. One interpretation places individuals within the familiar story of humanity. The other places them within an epic narrative of hidden origins. Most people find the second option more exciting. History demonstrates this tendency repeatedly. Legends endure because they provide emotionally satisfying frameworks. They transform uncertainty into narrative. They offer identities, origins, and destinies. The challenge arises when narrative begins replacing evidence. Modern archaeology has repeatedly shown that ancient civilizations were impressive enough without embellishment. The builders of megalithic monuments, the creators of early cities, the navigators crossing dangerous seas, and the agricultural societies transforming landscapes accomplished extraordinary things using knowledge developed over generations. No lost supercivilization is required to explain these achievements. Human ingenuity is sufficient. The same principle applies to Rh-negative blood. Its existence does not require Atlantis. Its distribution does not require a vanished continent. Population genetics provides mechanisms capable of producing the observed patterns. Yet the allure of Atlantis serves as a reminder that scientific explanations do not always satisfy deeper psychological needs. People want stories. They want mysteries. They want connections linking present identities to ancient worlds. As discussions continued, attention increasingly shifted away from hypothetical lost continents and toward a real population living on the Atlantic edge of Europe. Unlike Atlantis, these people undeniably existed. Their language survived. Their culture endured. Their genetic characteristics attracted intense interest. For many investigators, they seem to offer a tangible clue within a sea of speculation. If any population stood at the center of the Rh-negative mystery, it was the one nestled between the Pyrenees Mountains and the Bay of Biscay. The Basques, and the deeper researchers looked into their history, the more intriguing the puzzle became. The Basque country does not look like the setting of a global mystery. Green hills descend toward the Atlantic coast. Rivers cut through valleys framed by rugged mountains. Fishing towns cling to shorelines shaped by centuries of wind and salt. Villages occupy landscapes that have supported human communities for thousands of years. At first glance, there seems to be nothing extraordinary here. Yet for generations, scholars, linguists, geneticists, and historians have returned to this region again and again. The reason is simple. The Basques appear different. Not dramatically different, not isolated from the rest of humanity, but different enough to attract attention. Their language stands at the center of that fascination. Across most of Europe, languages belong to the vast Indo-European family. English, Spanish, French, German, Russian, Greek, and many others share deep ancestral roots despite their obvious differences. Linguists can trace relationships among them stretching back thousands of years. Euskara, the Basque language, refuses to fit. It does not neatly belong to the Indo-European family. It has no widely accepted living relative. For centuries, scholars attempted to connect it to languages from distant regions. Some proposed links to the Caucasus, others searched North Africa, the Near East, or even more remote locations. None of these theories achieved broad acceptance. Today, Euskara is generally regarded as a language isolate. In practical terms, that means it stands alone. This fact immediately raises historical questions. How did such a language survive while countless others disappeared? What does it reveal about the people who spoke it? Could it preserve traces of a population stretching deep into European prehistory? These questions became even more compelling when genetic studies revealed elevated frequencies of Rh-negative blood among Basque populations. To many observers, the combination seemed extraordinary. An unusual language, an unusual blood type frequency, an ancient population living in a geographically distinctive region. The temptation to connect these elements was powerful. Soon, theories multiplied. Some writers describe the Basques as direct descendants of Europe's earliest inhabitants. Others claimed they represented survivors of Atlantis. A few proposed that they preserved genetic characteristics from populations predating all known civilizations. Reality proved more complicated. The Basques are neither frozen remnants of an untouched prehistoric people nor survivors of a vanished super-civilization. Modern genetic research paints a far richer picture. Ancient DNA studies have transformed understanding of European history over the past 2 decades. Scientists can now compare genetic information from prehistoric skeletons with modern populations, revealing patterns that were invisible to earlier generations. The results show that Europe experienced repeated demographic transformations. Hunter-gatherers occupied the continent after the last ice age. Early farmers arrived from Anatolia and surrounding regions, bringing agriculture and new ways of life. Later migrations from the Eurasian steppe contributed additional ancestry across much of Europe. Modern Europeans emerge from varying combinations of these ancestral components. The Basques participated in this history. They are not separate from it. What makes them interesting is not complete isolation, but relative continuity. Evidence suggests that Basque populations retained substantial ancestry connected to early farming communities in Western Europe, while experiencing less influence from certain later migrations than many neighbouring populations. The details remain the subject of ongoing research, and scholars still debate aspects of the process. Nevertheless, the picture increasingly points toward long-term regional continuity rather than mysterious external origins. In other words, the Basques appear remarkable not because they came from somewhere impossible, but because they remained where they were. That distinction changes everything. Human history often focuses on movement. Empires expand, tribes migrate, armies conquer territories, entire populations relocate, yet continuity can be just as significant as migration. A community that remains rooted in the same region for thousands of years may preserve cultural and genetic characteristics that become diluted elsewhere. The Basque language may owe its survival partly to geography. Mountains create barriers. Valleys encourage local identity. Regional cohesion helps traditions endure. None of these factors guarantee preservation, but together they can increase its likelihood. The same principle may help explain certain genetic patterns. If a population remains relatively stable over long periods, genetic characteristics present within that population can persist as well. No hidden continent is required. No forgotten race must be invoked. Ordinary demographic history can produce extraordinary outcomes. Yet the Basque mystery remained irresistible because ordinary demographic history is often anything but ordinary. Imagine the Iberian Peninsula near the end of the Ice Age. Glaciers retreat northward. Temperatures rise. Forests expand. Human communities adapt to changing environments. Over generations, descendants of ancient populations spread into newly accessible regions. Some remain close to ancestral homelands, others move farther afield. Thousands of years pass. Agriculture arrives. New cultures emerge. Trade networks develop. Empires rise and collapse. Through all these transformations, certain communities preserve distinctive identities. The Basques are one example. Their survival alone is remarkable. Languages disappear constantly throughout history. Conquest, migration, assimilation, and economic pressures often erase linguistic diversity. Yet Euskara endured despite the expansion of powerful neighbouring cultures. The Roman Empire arrived. The language survived. Medieval kingdoms rose. The language survived. Modern nation-states formed. The language survived. This persistence created an aura of antiquity around the Basques that naturally attracted attention. People began viewing them as living windows into Europe's distant past. There is some truth in that idea. There is also considerable exaggeration. Modern populations are never perfect snapshots of ancient populations. Every community changes over time, new influences arrive, genetic exchanges occur, cultures evolve. The Basques are no exception. Nevertheless, they remain enormously important for understanding European prehistory because they preserve clues about historical processes that affected the entire continent. Rich negative blood became one of those clues, not because it proves extraordinary ancestry, but because it contributes to a broader picture of population history. Researchers studying Rh negative frequencies among Basques generally interpret the pattern through established genetic mechanisms. Founder effects, genetic drift, long-term continuity, and historical demographic factors all likely played roles. The exact balance remains a topic of investigation. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. That uncertainty is significant. It demonstrates how science approaches mysteries differently than popular mythology. Scientific uncertainty does not mean anything is possible. It means evidence continues to accumulate. Researchers refine hypotheses. New data emerge. Conclusions become more precise. The Basque example illustrates this process beautifully. For centuries, the scholars possessed little information beyond language and historical observation. Today, genetic evidence provides entirely new perspectives, yet even now important questions remain open. How exactly did certain frequencies emerge? What demographic events mattered most? How did prehistoric population structures influence later generations? The answers are becoming clearer, but not all at once. And as the Basque mystery attracted increasing attention, another challenge emerged. Many people began confusing genuine scientific puzzles with claims that science had already rejected. The line between evidence and mythology was becoming harder to see. Understanding that distinction would become essential as discussions moved beyond population history and into a world filled with ancient races, lost kingdoms, secret bloodlines, and stories that often sounded convincing precisely because they contained small fragments of truth mixed with much larger assumptions. The distance between science and mythology is not always as wide as people imagine. Many myths begin with real observations. A strange landscape inspires a story. An unusual natural event becomes a legend. A surviving cultural memory transforms into folklore. Over time, details accumulate. Symbolism merges with history. What begins as a fragment of reality can eventually become almost unrecognizable. The Rh negative mystery followed a similar path. A genuine biological phenomenon existed. Researchers documented it. Population patterns appeared. Questions emerged. Then, gradually, layers of speculation gathered around the original observation. By the late 20th century, entire alternative histories were being constructed around Rh negative blood. Books, articles, television programs, and later internet communities proposed increasingly elaborate explanations. Some suggested forgotten races. Others invoked ancient priesthoods, hidden dynasties, or survivors of vanished civilizations. A few theories went far beyond historical speculation and entered territory that mainstream science considered entirely unsupported. What made these narratives persuasive to many people was not necessarily the quality of evidence. It was the way they combined real facts with imaginative interpretation. A real blood type, a real genetic difference, a real population history, then a leap, and another leap. Soon the story no longer resembled the original evidence. This pattern is remarkably common in historical mysteries. Consider an archaeological site whose purpose remains uncertain. Researchers propose several possible explanations. Popular culture often selects the most dramatic option and treats it as established fact. Nuance disappears, uncertainty becomes certainty. The same process affected negative blood. One frequently repeated claim suggested that Rh-negative individuals descended from a separate ancient race. Another argued that they represented remnants of a forgotten civilization possessing advanced knowledge. Still others propose connections to legendary beings described in ancient myths. The scientific evidence does not support these conclusions. Modern genetics paints a very different picture. Every human population studied to date shares overwhelmingly common ancestry within the broader human family. Differences among populations are real, but they exist within a framework of deep biological relatedness. Genetic variation accumulates through mutation, inheritance, migration, natural selection, and demographic history. Rh-negative blood fits comfortably within that framework. Researchers understand the genetic mechanisms responsible for the Rh factor. Specific changes affecting the relevant genes have been identified. These changes arise through normal biological processes. Nothing about Rh-negative blood requires the existence of a separate human species. Nothing about it demands a lost civilization. Nothing about it points towards supernatural origins. Yet dismissing mythology entirely would also be a mistake. Not because myths provide scientific explanations, but because they reveal something important about how humans interpret uncertainty. Throughout history, people have sought narratives capable of explaining unusual phenomena. Ancient cultures did this. Modern cultures do it as well. The only difference is that modern myths often incorporate scientific language. Terms such as genetics, DNA, ancestry, and bloodlines carry authority. When inserted into speculative narratives, they can make unsupported claims sound more credible than they actually are. A casual reader encountering such material may struggle to distinguish established findings from conjecture. This challenge became particularly significant as discussions about lost civilizations expanded. The 20th century witnessed enormous public interest in ancient mysteries. Archaeological discoveries revealed previously unknown cultures. Ancient monuments continued provoking debate. Underwater ruins, undeciphered scripts, and vanished societies captured imaginations around the world. Within this environment, Rh-negative blood appeared to offer a biological clue connecting modern people to forgotten chapters of history. The temptation proved difficult to resist. Imagine discovering that a trait carried by a minority of people occurs more frequently within certain ancient populations. It feels natural to wonder whether the trait preserves traces of something unusual. Sometimes it does, but unusual does not necessarily mean mysterious. A trait can become common within a population simply because of demographic history. Population genetics repeatedly demonstrates this principle. Small communities often experience what scientists call founder effects. If a relatively small group establishes a new population, characteristics carried by those founders may become disproportionately common among descendants. Over generations, the effect can become striking. Genetic drift produces similar outcomes. Chance alone can alter frequencies of specific traits within populations, particularly when populations remain relatively small or isolated. Traits may become more common or less common without providing any particular advantage. The process is statistical rather than dramatic. Yet its consequences can appear dramatic when viewed thousands of years later. A modern observer sees an unusual distribution and assumes something extraordinary happened. In reality, the explanation may involve countless ordinary births, deaths, migrations, and marriages unfolding over centuries. This does not make the story less fascinating. If anything, it highlights the complexity of human history. Consider Europe after the last ice age. Populations expand into newly habitable territories. Communities become separated by mountains, rivers, forests, and coastlines. Different groups experience different demographic pressures. Some flourish, others disappear. Genetic patterns emerge gradually. By the time written records appear, the processes responsible may already be thousands of years old. Trying to reconstruct those events is extraordinarily difficult. The evidence remains incomplete. Ancient DNA helps, but only a tiny fraction of past populations leave recoverable genetic material. Archaeology fills some gaps. Linguistics contributes additional clues. Together, these fields reveal broad patterns while leaving many details unresolved. This uncertainty creates space for competing narratives. Scientific explanations emphasize probabilities, evidence, and revision. Mythological explanations emphasize meaning, symbolism, and dramatic coherence. Both appeal to different human instincts. The challenge arises when mythology begins presenting itself as science. Orange negative blood became a perfect example of this tension. Some claims sounded plausible because they borrowed scientific terminology. References to genetics, ancestry, and evolution created an impression of rigor, yet closer examination often revealed missing evidence, unsupported assumptions, or conclusions extending far beyond available data. Researchers repeatedly encountered the same problem. A real observation would be identified. Then it would be connected to a speculative theory. The speculative theory would eventually be repeated so often that many people assumed it had been proven. This process transformed Auric negative blood into one of the modern world's most persistent pseudo-historical mysteries. And yet, beneath the myths, a genuine scientific mystery still existed. Not a mystery about lost races, not a mystery about Atlantis, not a mystery about supernatural origins, a mystery about human history itself. Why do certain genetic traits persist? How do populations change across millennia? What demographic events shaped modern genetic landscapes? These questions remain profoundly important. The answers lie not in legends alone, but in the deep prehistoric past, where small groups of humans struggled through ice ages, survived environmental catastrophes, and unknowingly carried genetic variations that would still be visible thousands of generations later. To understand Rh negative blood fully, the story must travel far beyond written history, into a world where survival itself was uncertain and where the foundations of modern humanity were being shaped by forces few people today ever imagine. To understand how a rare genetic trait can persist for thousands of years, it is necessary to leave behind kingdoms, legends, and written history entirely. The story now enters a world so distant that no names survive. No cities exist. No monuments rise above the landscape. No chronicles record victories or defeats. Instead, there are only small groups of humans moving across vast territories, following herds, adapting to changing climates, and confronting challenges that would shape the future of every population on Earth. This is the world of deep prehistory. For most of human existence, people lived in communities that were astonishingly small by modern standards. A village containing a few dozen individuals represented a significant social unit. Entire regional populations might number only in the thousands. Such conditions have enormous genetic consequences. Today, billions of people are connected through global transportation, migration, and communication. Genetic variation spreads through populations in ways that would have been unimaginable to prehistoric humans. ancient communities experienced a very different reality. Many groups remained separated by mountains, rivers, deserts, forests, or sheer distance. Some populations interacted regularly. Others encountered outsiders only rarely. Under these circumstances, chance becomes powerful. A trait carried by a handful of individuals can gradually become common within descendants. Another trait may disappear entirely. Over long periods, isolated populations often develop distinctive genetic profiles. Rh-negative blood likely owes much of its modern distribution to such processes. To see why, imagine a small community living somewhere in Ice Age Europe. Among its members, a particular genetic variation exists at low frequency. The variation is neither especially beneficial nor especially harmful, it simply exists. Now imagine that environmental conditions change. Temperatures fall. Resources become scarce. Nearby populations disappear. Only a fraction of the original community survives. The descendants of those survivors inherit whatever genetic characteristics happen to be present among them. This phenomenon is known as a population bottleneck. Bottlenecks have repeatedly influenced human history. When populations shrink dramatically, genetic diversity is reduced. Certain traits become more common not because they are superior, but because chance favored their survival. Future generations inherit the consequences. The process sounds simple. Its effects can persist for tens of thousands of years. Scientists believe bottlenecks have played important roles throughout human evolution. In fact, some research suggests that ancient human populations occasionally became astonishingly small. At several points in prehistory, humanity may have come far closer to extinction than most people realize. Climate fluctuations repeatedly challenged survival. Volcanic eruptions altered environments. Droughts transformed ecosystems. Changing temperatures reshaped entire continents. Every surviving population carries the legacy of those crises. The genetic record preserves traces of ancient hardships that no written source could ever describe. What survives in the evidence suggests that Ice Age Europe experienced particularly dramatic demographic fluctuations. During colder periods, populations retreated into refuges where conditions remained tolerable. During warmer intervals, they expanded into newly available territories. These repeated contractions and expansions created ideal conditions for genetic drift. Traits that were once uncommon could become more common. Traits that were once common could decline. The process occurred gradually, generation after generation. No individual living through it would have recognized the long-term consequences. Yet thousands of years later, scientists can still detect some of those outcomes. Ancient DNA has revolutionized understanding of these processes. Only a few decades ago, researchers relied primarily on archaeology and modern population studies. Today, genetic material recovered from prehistoric skeletons allows direct comparisons between ancient and modern populations. The results are extraordinary. Again and again, ancient DNA reveals histories that nobody expected. Populations once assumed to be continuous sometimes prove surprisingly different from their predecessors. Communities believed unrelated occasionally showed deep ancestral connections. Entire migrations invisible in the archaeological record emerge from genetic evidence. One of the most important lessons from this research is that human history is rarely linear. Populations mix, separate, move, return, disappear, reappear. The story resembles a braided river rather than a straight line. Within that complexity, Rh-negative blood becomes easier to understand. Instead of searching for a single origin, researchers examine networks of ancestry extending across thousands of years. Genetic traits do not belong exclusively to one civilization or one people. They travel through populations, sometimes increasing in frequency, sometimes decreasing, always shaped by demographic history. This perspective contrasts sharply with popular theories about secret bloodlines. Reality is usually more complicated. And more interesting, consider the end of the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, the world entered a period of profound transformation. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, forests expanded across regions previously dominated by open tundra, animal populations shifted, human communities adapted to entirely new environmental conditions. These changes affected where people lived, how they obtained food, and whom they interacted with. Every such change influenced genetic patterns. Some groups expanded rapidly. Others remained relatively isolated. Some disappeared altogether. The descendants of survivors inherited the demographic consequences. Modern populations still reflect those ancient events. The evidence remains incomplete, but a growing body of research suggests that many genetic patterns visible today originated through combinations of migration, isolation, and population turnover occurring long before recorded history. Rich negative blood appears to fit within this framework. The trait is unusual, but unusual traits are not uncommon in genetics. What matters is understanding the historical processes that shaped their distribution. And those processes often lead back to environments rather than civilizations. A mountain range can influence genetics more effectively than an empire. A coastline can preserve population continuity longer than a kingdom. A valley can isolate communities for centuries. Geography frequently leaves deeper genetic marks than politics. This realization has transformed how scholars think about ancestry. Earlier generations often searched for grand historical explanations. Modern researchers increasingly recognize the importance of local demographic processes operating over immense spans of time. The results can seem counterintuitive. A population does not need to conquer a continent to leave a lasting genetic legacy. Sometimes survival alone is enough. A small community enduring through difficult centuries may contribute more to future generations than larger groups that ultimately disappear. The past is full of such surprises. Yet deep prehistory introduces another intriguing possibility. What if some genetic patterns visible today were influenced not only by modern humans, but also by encounters with other human species? The question may sound extraordinary, but unlike many popular theories surrounding Rh-negative blood, this one is firmly grounded in evidence. Modern humans were not always alone. For tens of thousands of years, they shared the world with other human relatives. Some looked different. Some lived in different environments. Some vanished completely. Yet traces of their existence remain inside living people. And their discovery would fundamentally change how humanity understood its own origins. For much of modern history, people imagined human evolution as a simple progression. Primitive ancestors gradually transformed into modern humans. Earlier forms disappeared. The story moved forward in a straight line. The reality proved far stranger. As archaeological discoveries accumulated throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers realized that the human family tree was not a single branch. It was a tangled network of related populations, many existing at the same time. Different human species and groups occupied different parts of the world. Some thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. Others vanished without leaving obvious descendants. By the beginning of the 21st century, a new revolution was underway. Ancient DNA. Scientists were no longer limited to studying bones and tools. In certain cases, they could recover genetic material from long-dead individuals and compare it directly with living populations. The results were astonishing. One of the first major surprises involved the Neanderthals. For decades, many researchers assumed that Neanderthals had disappeared completely after modern humans spread across Eurasia. The prevailing view suggested replacement rather than interaction. Ancient DNA revealed a different story. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. Not constantly. Not everywhere. But enough that traces of Neanderthal ancestry survive in many living populations today. People outside sub-Saharan Africa generally carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA, inherited from ancient encounters that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. Suddenly, the human story became more complicated. Modern humanity was not entirely separate from its extinct relatives. The boundaries were more porous than previously imagined. Soon another discovery followed. In a remote cave in Siberia, researchers identified genetic evidence belonging to an unknown human group. These individuals became known as the Denisovans, named after the cave where their remains were found. The discovery was remarkable. Scientists identified an entirely new branch of humanity largely through DNA rather than traditional fossils. Even more surprising, Denisovan ancestry survives in certain modern populations, particularly in parts of Asia and Oceania. Again, the story of human origins grew more complex. Different groups met. Different groups mixed. Different groups left descendants. The implications extended far beyond anthropology. Human history was no longer a simple tale of one species replacing another. It became a story of encounters, exchanges, and survival. Naturally, some observers wondered whether these discoveries could explain Rh-negative blood. Could the trait originate from Neanderthals? Could it come from Denisovans? Could interactions with extinct human relatives account for its unusual distribution? The idea gained attention because it appeared more plausible than many alternative theories. Unlike Atlantis, Neanderthals were real. Unlike mythical civilizations, Denisovans undeniably existed. Yet scientific evidence does not currently support the claim that Rh-negative blood originated through inheritance from these extinct populations. Researchers have examined ancient genomes extensively. While Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry contributed certain genetic variations to modern humans, the Rh factor appears explainable through genetic mechanisms operating within modern human populations themselves. This distinction matters. Not every mystery requires an extraordinary solution. The existence of ancient interbreeding demonstrates that surprising events occurred in human history, but it does not automatically validate every speculative theory. Still, the discovery of extinct relatives provides an important lesson. Human ancestry is often more complicated than expected. Consider Europe around 40,000 years ago. Modern humans spread across landscapes already occupied by Neanderthals. For thousands of years, these populations existed within overlapping regions. They hunted many of the same animals. They adapted to similar climates. Occasionally, they produced children together. The consequences remain visible today. A person walking through a modern city may unknowingly carry fragments of DNA inherited from individuals who lived tens of thousands of years before the first cities were ever built. The past survives in unexpected ways. This realization helps explain why discussions about Rh-negative blood became so persistent. People intuitively understand that genetics preserves history. A trait visible today can indeed reflect events that occurred thousands of years ago. The challenge lies in identifying which events. Scientific investigation requires evidence. Popular speculation often begins with possibility. The two approaches are not the same. One asks what the data support. The other asks what might be imaginable. The difference becomes especially important when examining deep prehistory. Ancient DNA has repeatedly overturned assumptions. Researchers once believed they understood major aspects of human migration. New evidence revealed previously unknown population movements. Entire chapters of prehistory had to be rewritten. This process continues today. Every year brings additional discoveries. Burial sites yield genetic information. New analytical techniques improve accuracy. Historical reconstructions become more detailed. What emerges is a picture of humanity defined by movement. Groups traveled extraordinary distances. Ideas spread across continents. Genes flowed through populations in ways that often defy modern expectations. The human world of prehistory was smaller than today's global society, but far more connected than earlier scholars imagined. This matters because it changes how unusual genetic patterns are interpreted. Older theories sometimes assumed that distinctive traits required distinctive origins. Modern genetics often reaches different conclusions. A trait may become concentrated within a population simply because of demographic history, rather than because that population descended from an entirely separate source. Migration, isolation, founder effects, and drift can produce results that appear mysterious when viewed without context. The more researchers learn, the more powerful these mechanisms appear. Yet another question remained. Even if Rh-negative blood emerged through ordinary genetic processes, why did certain populations preserve relatively high frequencies while others did not? Population bottlenecks offered part of the answer. Isolation explained another part. But many observers continued searching for larger historical narratives. They wanted to know whether specific peoples, cultures, or civilizations carried these genetic patterns into history. Could ancient builders, traders, navigators, and farmers have played a role? Could the rise of civilization itself have influenced the distribution visible today? The evidence would lead away from legends and towards something far more revealing. The immense demographic transformations that accompanied the birth of agriculture, the growth of settlements, and the emergence of the first complex societies. The answer, as often happens in history, was not hidden inside a lost civilization. It was hidden inside the ordinary lives of millions of people whose cumulative choices reshaped the human world. Civilizations often appear in history books as if they emerge suddenly. A city rises beside a river. Monumental architecture appears. Trade networks expand. Writing develops. Kings, priests, and merchants enter the historical record. From a distance, the transformation can seem almost instantaneous. The reality unfolds much more slowly. Long before the first cities, countless generations of people altered the world through small decisions repeated over and over again. They planted seeds, domesticated animals, cleared forests, built permanent settlements, shared technologies, traded ideas. Civilization did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated, and as populations grew, the genetic landscape of humanity changed alongside it. This broader demographic story became increasingly important for understanding Rh-negative blood. Many alternative theories claim that rare blood types mark the descendants of civilization builders. According to these narratives, specific genetic lineages supposedly founded ancient societies and spread advanced knowledge across continents. The appeal of such ideas is obvious. History often celebrates founders. People like to imagine hidden elites standing behind great achievements. Yet archaeology reveals a different pattern. Civilization emerged independently in multiple regions through processes that unfolded over thousands of years. The earliest urban societies appeared in places such as Mesopotamia, Nile Valley, the Indus region, northern China, and later elsewhere around the world. These developments occurred under different conditions. Different languages, different environments, different populations. No evidence suggests that a single hidden lineage created them all. Instead, civilization appears to be a recurring outcome of human societies reaching certain thresholds of population density, agricultural productivity, and social complexity. This conclusion carries important implications. If Rh-negative blood occurs at varying frequencies among modern populations, those frequencies do not automatically identify the descendants of ancient rulers, architects, or cultural innovators. Human achievements belong to entire societies rather than isolated bloodlines. The pyramids were not built by a genetic trait. Neither were ancient cities, trade routes, or writing systems. Millions of people contributed to those accomplishments. Still, civilization did affect genetics in profound ways. As agriculture spread, human populations expanded dramatically. Communities that once numbered in the hundreds grew into the thousands and eventually the millions. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. With growth came increased movement. People traveled farther. Trade connected distant regions. Marriage networks expanded. Genetic exchange accelerated. These processes often reduced the effects of isolation that had shaped earlier populations. Imagine two small prehistoric communities separated by mountains. For centuries, they interact only rarely. Distinctive genetic characteristics gradually develop within each group. Now imagine the arrival of agriculture. Population densities increase. Paths become roads. Trade becomes routine. Individuals move between regions more frequently. Over time, genetic differences begin to blur. Civilization can act as a powerful mixing force. Yet the process is never uniform. Some populations become highly interconnected. Others remain relatively isolated. Mountain regions, islands, and remote territories often preserve distinctive characteristics long after surrounding areas become integrated into larger networks. This helps explain why certain genetic patterns survive, not because civilization created them, but because civilization did not erase them completely. The Basques provide one example. Various island populations provide others. Geography continues influencing genetic history even in increasingly connected worlds. Modern population genetics repeatedly demonstrates this principle. The frequencies observed today reflect not a single event but countless overlapping processes. Ancient bottlenecks, migrations, agricultural expansions, regional isolation, population growth, historical disruptions. Each contributes something to the final picture. This complexity often frustrates people seeking simple answers. A lost civilization offers a clear narrative. Real demographic history rarely does. Yet the real story possesses its own kind of grandeur. Consider the first farmers moving gradually across Europe. Over generations, they transformed landscapes and ways of life. Forests became fields, settlements became permanent, populations expanded. These changes influenced the ancestry of millions of future people. Or consider later migrations from the Eurasian steppe. Entire cultural traditions spread across vast distances. Languages expanded, technologies moved between regions. Again, genetic patterns shifted. No single event explains modern populations. Instead, history resembles layers accumulating over time. Rh-negative blood became one small component within this immense process. Researchers investigating its distribution increasingly focus on demographic history rather than civilizational myths. The question is not which lost kingdom produced the trait. The question is which historical processes influenced its frequency. The distinction is subtle but crucial. One approach searches for extraordinary origins. The other examines ordinary human history operating across extraordinary spans of time. Ancient DNA studies have strengthened this perspective. Again and again, researchers discover that major population changes occurred long before written records. Entire demographic transformations unfolded invisibly from the standpoint of traditional history. Civilizations often inherited genetic landscapes shaped by events thousands of years older than themselves. This realization changes how ancestry is understood. A trait present in a modern population may predate local kingdoms, empires, and even agricultural societies. Its roots may extend into deep prehistory. Rh-negative blood likely belongs to this category. The trait's story appears connected less to the rise of civilization than to the populations that existed before civilization emerged. That doesn't make it more mysterious. It makes it older. Much older. And age itself often generates fascination. People naturally seek connections to ancient origins. They want continuity with distant ancestors. They want evidence that something within them links the present to forgotten worlds. Genetics genuinely provide such connections, but the connections are usually broader than expected. Rather than linking individuals to a specific lost civilization, genetics links all humans to vast networks of ancestors stretching across continents and millennia. Every living person descends from countless populations. Every family tree eventually becomes a forest. The farther back one looks, the more intertwined humanity becomes. This insight challenges many popular theories about special bloodlines. History rarely belongs to isolated groups. Human populations have always been interacting, exchanging ideas, and sharing ancestry. The boundaries people imagine are often far more porous than they appear. Yet despite growing scientific understanding, one aspect of Rh-negative blood continued attracting attention more than any other. It was not Atlantis. It was not ancient civilizations. It was not the Basques. It was a medical phenomenon, a real biological interaction between mother and child that seemed, at least to some observers, almost symbolic of deeper mysteries. For decades, this phenomenon fueled speculation about human origins and provided perhaps the most frequently cited argument in support of extraordinary theories. Understanding what it actually means requires returning to medicine, where the Rh-negative story began in the first place. Among all the ideas associated with Rh-negative blood, none has generated more speculation than the phenomenon known as Rh incompatibility. For many people encountering the subject for the first time, this medical condition appears genuinely puzzling. An Rh-negative mother can carry an Rh-positive child without difficulty during a first pregnancy. Yet under certain circumstances, exposure to fetal blood may cause the mother's immune system to recognize the Rh factor as foreign. If another Rh-positive pregnancy occurs later, antibodies can potentially affect the developing child. Before modern medical treatment, the consequences could sometimes be severe. Today, preventive care has dramatically reduced these risks. In much of the world, Rh incompatibility is a manageable medical issue rather than a major threat. Yet the underlying biology remains fascinating. And for decades it became a central pillar of many speculative theories. The reasoning often followed a similar pattern. If Rh-negative mothers can experience complications involving Rh-positive children, perhaps Rh-negative individuals originated from a different ancestral group. Perhaps the biological interaction reflected some deeper separation within humanity. To many non-specialists, the idea sounded plausible. Unfortunately, biology is rarely that simple. The immune system recognizes countless differences. Blood groups themselves are evidence of this reality. The existence of immunological reactions does not automatically imply separate species. hidden races, or mysterious origins. Medical science explains Rh incompatibility through well-understood immunological mechanisms. The phenomenon is unusual but not unique. The human body constantly distinguishes between self and non-self. This ability is essential for survival. Without it, the immune system could not protect against infection. The Rh factor simply becomes one of many biological markers that the immune system can recognize under certain circumstances. Yet because the condition involves pregnancy, it carries emotional weight. Questions about mothers, children, ancestry and inheritance naturally resonate with people. These themes sit close to the heart of human identity. As a result, medical realities often became transformed into symbolic narratives. Throughout the 20th century, writers seeking extraordinary explanations pointed to Rh incompatibility as evidence that Rh-negative individuals somehow stood apart from the rest of humanity. Modern genetics does not support this interpretation. Rh-negative and Rh-positive individuals belong to the same species, share common ancestry and intermarry successfully. The medical phenomenon reflects inherited biological variation rather than separate origins. Still, the persistence of such theories reveals something important. People often interpret biological facts through historical and cultural lenses. A medical condition becomes a clue. A genetic variation becomes a story. An immunological mechanism becomes a mystery. This transformation occurs repeatedly throughout history. Consider how earlier societies interpreted diseases before understanding germs. Symptoms that now seem medically straightforward once inspired explanations involving spirits, curses, divine intervention, or supernatural forces. The observations were real. The explanations differed. Something similar happened with Rh-negative blood. The biological facts remained constant. The interpretations varied enormously. Part of the fascination stems from the fact that reproduction occupies a special place within human thought. Every culture develops stories about ancestry, inheritance, and descent. Questions about where people come from are among the oldest questions humans ask. When Rh incompatibility entered public awareness, many observers instinctively linked it to those larger themes. Could it reveal hidden ancestry? Could it preserve traces of ancient divisions? Could it point toward forgotten chapters of human evolution? Scientific evidence suggested otherwise. Yet the questions persisted because they touched something deeper than biology alone. They touched identity. Imagine living before modern genetics existed. You notice that certain traits appear within families. Characteristics pass from parents to children. Some lineages seem distinctive, others disappear over time. Without knowledge of chromosomes or DNA, inheritance appears mysterious. Many ancient cultures developed elaborate beliefs around bloodlines for precisely this reason. Blood became a symbol of continuity, a visible representation of ancestry, a connection between generations. Even today, language preserves echoes of these ideas. People speak of bloodlines, blood relations, and shared blood. The symbolism remains powerful despite scientific advances. Rh-negative blood entered this symbolic landscape almost immediately. Because it was both real and uncommon, it acquired significance beyond its biological role. Writers associated it with noble lineages, ancient priesthoods, legendary rulers, and survivors of lost civilizations. Some theories became increasingly elaborate, weaving together genetics, mythology, religion, and alternative history into grand narratives that extended far beyond available evidence. The attraction is understandable. A rare trait feels special. A special trait invites explanation. A dramatic explanation often proves more memorable than a mundane one. Yet science repeatedly demonstrates that rarity does not necessarily imply mystery. Many uncommon genetic traits exist throughout humanity. Some occur frequently within specific populations. Others appear scattered across the globe. Most result from ordinary hereditary processes operating over long periods. Rh-negative blood appears to belong within that category. The evidence points toward inheritance, demographic history, and population genetics rather than hidden origins. Even so, the medical dimension remains genuinely important. The discovery of the Rh factor transformed healthcare. Understanding Rh incompatibility saved lives and improved outcomes for countless families. What began as a scientific investigation into blood transfusions ultimately produced one of medicine's significant advances. This practical achievement is sometimes overshadowed by more sensational narratives. That is unfortunate. The real history is remarkable enough. Researchers identified a previously unknown biological system. They explained mysterious medical complications. They developed effective interventions. Millions benefited. No lost civilization could improve upon that accomplishment. Yet as scientific understanding expanded, popular interest moved in another direction. Attention increasingly shifted toward ancient texts. If genetics could not conclusively support extraordinary theories, perhaps mythology could. Across cultures, stories existed describing gods descending from the sky, giant beings walking the earth, unusual bloodlines, and semi-divine ancestors. Some writers began interpreting these traditions through the lens of Rh-negative blood. Connections were proposed. Patterns were identified. Ancient legends acquired new meanings. Whether those interpretations reflected historical reality was another question entirely. But once mythology entered the discussion, the Rh-negative mystery expanded beyond genetics and medicine into a realm where symbols, stories, and human imagination had been shaping perceptions of the past for thousands of years. Long before anyone understood genetics, ancient societies were already fascinated by unusual ancestry. Kings claimed descent from gods. Noble families traced their origins to legendary heroes. Entire civilizations constructed stories explaining why certain bloodlines possessed authority, wisdom, or special status. These narratives served political, religious, and cultural purposes. They helped societies organize power. They provided meaning. They connected the present to a sacred past. Thousands of years later, some of these same stories would be drawn into discussions about Rh-negative blood. The process was almost inevitable. Once a rare biological trait became associated with mystery, people began searching ancient texts for clues. References to unusual lineages suddenly attracted attention. Legends involving divine ancestry were reinterpreted. Myths that had existed for centuries acquired entirely new meanings. The result was a fascinating blend of history, mythology, and speculation. One frequently cited example involved stories of gods descending from the heavens. Many ancient cultures contain narratives about powerful beings arriving from elsewhere. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Mesoamerica, and numerous other regions, mythological traditions describe interactions between humans and divine figures. Within their original cultural context, these stories served religious and symbolic functions. They explained natural phenomena, legitimized rulers, and expressed spiritual beliefs. Modern speculative theories often reinterpret them very differently. Instead of viewing such accounts as mythology, some writers treat them as literal descriptions of extraordinary events. From there, they sometimes connect these events to unusual bloodlines and, eventually, to Rh-negative blood. The leap is substantial. The evidence supporting it is minimal. Yet the idea remains popular because it transforms ancient stories into hidden historical records. People enjoy the possibility that myths conceal secrets. Sometimes they do contain fragments of historical memory. More often they reflect the values, fears, and aspirations of the cultures that created them. Distinguishing between these possibilities is one of history's most difficult tasks. Consider flood myths. Many civilizations preserve stories involving catastrophic floods. Some scholars believe certain flood narratives may contain distant echoes of real environmental events. Others emphasize symbolic and religious dimensions. The truth may involve both. Myths can preserve memories while simultaneously transforming them. The same principle applies to stories about unusual ancestors. A narrative describing divine lineage does not necessarily document a biological reality. It may express social prestige, spiritual authority, or political legitimacy. Ancient audiences understood these stories differently than modern readers often do. This difference matters. When modern theories connect Rh-negative blood to ancient myths, they frequently overlook the cultural contexts in which those myths originally developed. A symbolic narrative becomes a genetic claim. A religious tradition becomes an ancestry hypothesis. The transformation can be persuasive, but it is rarely supported by evidence. One recurring theme involves giants. Numerous cultures contain stories about unusually large beings inhabiting the world before or alongside ordinary humans. These figures appear in mythologies across continents. Some alternative theories suggest that references to giants preserve memories of ancient populations associated with Rh-negative blood. Again, the evidence does not support such conclusions. Human skeletal remains have been studied extensively. While exceptionally tall individuals certainly existed throughout history, there is no credible evidence for a separate race of giants linked to Rh-negative ancestry. Nevertheless, the association persists because it satisfies a familiar pattern. An ancient mystery appears. A rare genetic trait exists. The two are connected through speculation. Over time, repetition creates an illusion of evidence. Another frequently discussed theme involves sacred kingship. Many ancient rulers claimed divine descent. Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian monarchs, Roman emperors, and countless others associated themselves with supernatural ancestry. Such claims enhanced legitimacy and reinforced authority. Modern readers sometimes interpret these traditions literally. If rulers claimed special bloodlines, perhaps those bloodlines corresponded to identifiable genetic traits. The idea is intriguing. The evidence remains absent. Genetics can reveal ancestry patterns, but it cannot confirm mythological claims of divine origin. Ancient royal families were human populations like any other, subject to the same biological processes affecting everyone else. Still, these stories reveal something important about humanity's relationship with ancestry. People have always sought meaning in lineage. Questions about origin, inheritance, and identity are universal. Every generation wonders where it came from. Every culture develops narratives addressing that question. Rh-negative blood entered this landscape because it offered a tangible biological characteristic around which stories could form. The trait became a canvas. Different groups projected different meanings onto it. Some saw evidence of forgotten civilizations. Others saw proof of special ancestry. Still others viewed it as confirmation of spiritual or religious beliefs. The remarkable thing is not that such interpretations emerged. The remarkable thing is how persistent they became despite growing scientific understanding. Part of the reason lies in the nature of uncertainty. Science excels at explaining mechanisms. It explains how traits are inherited, how populations evolve, how genetic variation spreads. Yet science often provides answers that feel emotionally unsatisfying. Population drift lacks the dramatic power of a lost kingdom. Founder effect cannot compete with divine ancestry. Statistical probabilities rarely inspire the imagination like ancient myths do. This tension has existed throughout history. Evidence points one way, stories pull another. The Rh negative mystery sits directly at that intersection. On one side stands genetics, archaeology, and anthropology. On the other stand legends, symbols, and human fascination with hidden origins. Neither side can be ignored completely. The myths reveal cultural desires. The science reveals historical reality. Together they explain why the mystery has endured for so long. Yet while mythology continued generating speculation, scientific research was entering a new era. Massive genetic databases, advanced sequencing technologies, and ancient DNA studies were transforming understanding at an unprecedented pace. Questions that had once seemed impossible to answer suddenly became accessible. Researchers could now examine human ancestry with extraordinary precision. Many long-standing assumptions were challenged. Some theories gained support. Others collapsed entirely. The DNA revolution would not solve every mystery surrounding Rh negative blood, but it would fundamentally change the conversation. For the first time, researchers possessed tools capable of testing ideas that had previously existed only as speculation, and the results proved both revealing and surprising. The DNA revolution did not arrive all at once. It emerged through decades of technological progress, each breakthrough revealing a little more of humanity's hidden past. What began as the ability to identify individual genes eventually expanded into the capacity to sequence entire genomes. Researchers could now compare populations across continents, reconstruct ancient migrations, and recover genetic information from people who had been dead for thousands of years. For historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists, the change was transformative. Questions that once relied largely on inference could now be investigated directly. Ancient ancestry ceased to be a matter of guesswork alone. The genetic record began speaking for itself. When these new tools were applied to questions surrounding Rh negative blood, many popular assumptions faced a difficult test. Some theories predicted evidence of a separate ancestral population. Others anticipated genetic signatures pointing toward lost civilizations or unusual origins. The results were far less dramatic and far more informative. Modern genetic studies consistently place Rh negative individuals within the normal spectrum of human genetic diversity. The trait does not define a separate branch of humanity. It does not mark the descendants of an isolated species. It does not identify survivors of a hidden civilization. Instead, it behaves like other inherited genetic characteristics shaped by population history. This conclusion may sound straightforward, but reaching it required enormous amounts of research. Scientists examined genes associated with the Rh factor across different populations. They compared frequencies, traced inheritance patterns, and studied evolutionary mechanisms capable of producing observed distributions. The emerging picture pointed toward demographic history rather than extraordinary ancestry. In some ways, the findings were exactly what population geneticists expected. In other ways, they revealed a level of complexity that few earlier researchers could have imagined. One of the most important discoveries involved the sheer interconnectedness of human populations. For centuries, many people assumed that ancient groups remained largely separate from one another. The genetic evidence tells a different story. Human populations have been mixing, migrating, and exchanging ancestry throughout history. Even regions that appear isolated today often reveal evidence of ancient connections. Trade routes carried more than goods. Migrations carried more than cultures. People themselves moved across surprising distances. Their descendants inherited the consequences. This does not mean every population became genetically identical. Geography still mattered, isolation still occurred, distinctive regional characteristics still developed. But the overall picture is one of interaction rather than separation. The Basques provide an excellent example. Earlier generations often imagined them as a population preserved unchanged from deep prehistory. Modern DNA studies tell a more nuanced story. The Basques do preserve important elements of ancient regional ancestry, yet they are not untouched relics frozen in time. They participated in the same broad historical processes affecting neighbouring populations, even if some influences reach them differently or with reduced intensity. The reality is more complicated than either complete isolation or complete continuity, and that complexity appears repeatedly throughout genetic research. Ancient DNA has revealed migrations that transformed Europe multiple times. Hunter-gatherer populations gave way to incoming farming communities. Later migrations from the Eurasian steppe introduced additional ancestry across large regions. Subsequent movements continued reshaping populations throughout historical periods. Modern Europeans emerge from these layered processes. No single ancestral population can explain the whole picture. Rh-negative blood exists within that larger context. Its distribution reflects history, but not history in the way many popular theories imagined. Rather than pointing toward a lost civilization, the evidence points toward countless ordinary human events accumulating across millennia. Births, marriages, migrations, periods of isolation, episodes of expansion, moments of survival. The genetic landscape visible today is the result. This realization carries a certain irony. Many people became interested in Rh-negative blood because they hoped it would reveal a hidden chapter of history. In a sense, it does. Just not the chapter they expected. The real story is not about Atlantis. It is not about secret rulers. It is not about supernatural bloodlines. It is about how populations change over time, how chance influences inheritance, how geography shapes ancestry, how small communities can leave lasting genetic legacies. These processes may seem less dramatic than mythical civilizations, but they are no less remarkable. Imagine trying to reconstruct a journey that began 20,000 years ago. Every generation adds a step. Every family contributes a thread. Most individual stories vanish completely. Yet together they produce patterns that remain detectable thousands of years later. That is what genetics reveals. Not individual destinies, but collective histories. One of the most surprising outcomes of the DNA revolution has been the repeated discovery that human history is simultaneously more connected and more complicated than earlier scholars believed. Populations once thought unrelated often share ancestry. Groups assumed to be homogeneous reveal diverse origins. Simple narratives collapse under the weight of evidence. The past becomes richer, not poorer. This process continues today. Each year brings new discoveries. Ancient genomes are sequenced. Population models improve. Historical reconstructions become more precise. Some questions surrounding Rh-negative blood have been answered. Others remain open. Researchers still investigate why certain frequencies vary across populations. They continue refining models of migration and demographic change. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and no single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Science rarely ends with absolute certainty. Instead, it moves gradually toward better understanding. That distinction is important. Popular theories often promise final answers. Scientific research offers something different. It offers evidence. And evidence sometimes leads to conclusions that are less satisfying emotionally but more reliable historically. Yet despite decades of research, despite the growth of genetics, despite the accumulation of data, the Rh-negative mystery refuses to disappear from public imagination. Books continue to be written. Videos continue to be watched. New theories continue to emerge. The question is no longer simply what the evidence says. The question is why people remain so captivated by the mystery in the first place. Why do stories about hidden origins endure so powerfully? Why do lost civilizations continue attracting attention generation after generation? Why does a rare blood type inspire such extraordinary speculation? The answers lie not only in history or genetics, but in something deeply human. The enduring fascination with Rh-negative blood reveals something that extends far beyond genetics. It reveals how human beings think about themselves. Throughout history, people have searched for signs that they belong to something larger than ordinary existence. They seek connections to heroic ancestors, forgotten kingdoms, sacred traditions, and hidden histories. The desire appears in nearly every civilization ever studied. Ancient rulers claimed divine descent. Medieval nobles traced lineages to legendary heroes. Entire nations built identities around origin stories that blended memory and myth. Modern societies often imagine themselves as more rational, more scientific, and less susceptible to such narratives. Yet the same impulse remains. It has simply adopted new forms. Today, instead of divine ancestry, people may search for meaning in genetics. Instead of mythical bloodlines, they may seek answers in DNA reports. The language changes, but the underlying desire often remains remarkably similar. Rh-negative blood became a perfect vessel for this impulse because it combines several elements that humans find irresistibly attractive. It is real, it is uncommon, it involves ancestry, and it appears connected, however indirectly, to questions about deep history. Those ingredients create fertile ground for storytelling. Consider how many mysteries become popular. The most successful mysteries rarely involve complete ignorance. Instead, they combine known facts with unanswered questions. A vanished city attracts attention because it existed. An undeciphered script fascinates because it can be seen but not read. A rare blood type inspires speculation because it is medically real while still appearing unusual. Complete certainty leaves little room for imagination. Complete uncertainty provides too little foundation. The most enduring mysteries occupy the space in between. Rh-negative blood sits precisely in that space. Scientists understand its biological basis. Yet questions remain about specific historical pathways that shaped its distribution. Researchers possess strong explanations, yet the evidence remains incomplete in certain areas. This combination allows the mystery to persist. People naturally fill gaps with stories. Sometimes those stories remain close to the evidence. Sometimes they travel far beyond it. The internet accelerated this process dramatically. Before the digital age, speculative theories spread slowly through books, magazines, and word of mouth. Today, ideas can circle the globe within hours. Claims that once reached small audiences now attract millions of viewers. This environment favors dramatic narratives. A detailed explanation involving population genetics requires patience. A story about hidden descendants of a lost civilization can be summarized in a sentence. Human attention often gravitates towards simplicity, even when reality is complex. Consequently, Rh-negative blood became part of a broader cultural phenomenon. It joined Atlantis, ancient astronauts, lost continents, forgotten empires, secret societies. Each topic occupies a similar position within public imagination. They promise hidden knowledge. They suggest that official explanations overlook something important. They invite people to become investigators rather than passive observers. The appeal is powerful. In many cases, it has little to do with the specific evidence. Instead, it reflects a deeper psychological attraction to mystery itself. Anthropologists and historians have observed this tendency repeatedly. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We look for connections. We search for meaning. We prefer narratives to randomness. When confronted with unusual information, the mind often attempts to fit it into a coherent story. This tendency has obvious advantages. It helps people understand the world. It encourages curiosity. It supports learning. But it can also produce misleading conclusions. Patterns sometimes appear where none exist. Coincidences become evidence. Speculation becomes certainty. The history of Rh-negative theories illustrates this process remarkably well. A genuine biological trait exists. Certain populations display elevated frequencies. Ancient legends mention unusual lineages. Those observations are real. The leap occurs when they are woven together into a single explanation without sufficient evidence. The resulting narrative feels convincing because every component contains some truth. The problem lies in the connections. Science approaches the same puzzle differently. Researchers ask whether evidence supports a proposed link. If it does, confidence increases. If it does not, the hypothesis weakens. This method lacks the dramatic elegance of mythology, but it possesses a significant advantage. It can be tested. Again and again, scientific investigation has examined claims surrounding Rh-negative blood. Some ideas survived scrutiny, others did not. The trait remains biologically real. Its uneven distribution remains historically interesting. Its connection to lost civilizations remains unsupported. Yet the unsupported theories continue attracting attention. Why? Because they satisfy emotional needs that scientific explanations often leave untouched. A demographic model explains frequency distributions. It does not explain personal identity. A founder effect describes inheritance. It does not provide a sense of belonging to a grand narrative. A population bottleneck clarifies history. It does not transform ordinary life into a mystery. Humans frequently seek more than explanation. They seek significance. This search is neither irrational nor new. It has accompanied humanity throughout recorded history. The challenge lies in balancing wonder with evidence. The past is genuinely astonishing. Ancient migrations reshaped continents. Ice ages transformed landscapes. Languages survived against overwhelming odds. Entire cultures disappeared. Human beings crossed oceans, mountains, deserts, and frozen plains long before modern technology existed. None of these realities require embellishment. The evidence alone is extraordinary. Rh-negative blood belongs within that larger story. It is not a key unlocking hidden civilizations. It is a small but fascinating piece of humanity's vast and intricate history. And perhaps that is why the mystery endures. Not because the answers remain entirely hidden, but because the answers point towards something larger than any single theory. They point toward the complexity of human origins themselves. A complexity so immense that even now, despite all our technology, despite all our research, despite all our accumulated knowledge, significant questions remain. The mystery survives not in what we know, it survives in what we're still discovering. And that discovery is far from over. After centuries of legends, decades of scientific research, countless books, and endless speculation, the mystery of Rh-negative blood arrives at an unusual destination. Not a lost continent, not a hidden civilization, not a secret lineage ruling from the shadows of history. Instead, it arrives at the edge of what humanity currently knows about itself. That may sound less dramatic than the stories that often surround the subject, but in many ways it is far more profound. Because the true mystery was never really about a blood type. It was about origins. The moment people began asking where Rh negative blood came from, they inevitably began asking where populations come from, where cultures come from, and ultimately where humanity itself comes from. The question kept expanding. A rare genetic trait became a doorway into the deepest chapters of the human story. Along that journey, many popular theories emerged. Some connected Rh negative blood to Atlantis. Others linked it to ancient rulers, mysterious ancestors, forgotten migrations, or supernatural origins. These ideas flourished because they offered clear narratives in a landscape filled with uncertainty. Yet when researchers examined the evidence, a different picture emerged. The Rh factor belongs to the normal range of human genetic variation. Its inheritance follows understandable biological rules. Its distribution reflects population history rather than hidden civilizations. The strongest explanations involve migration, isolation, founder effects, demographic bottlenecks, and the countless ordinary processes that shape genetic diversity over long periods. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. The evidence remains incomplete in some areas. Scholars continue debating aspects of population history, but the overall direction of the research is remarkably consistent. The mystery becomes less about secret origins and more about the extraordinary complexity of real human history. That complexity is often underestimated. People imagine history as a sequence of civilizations rising and falling. In reality, civilizations occupy only a tiny fraction of the human story. For tens of thousands of years before the first cities appeared, populations moved across continents, adapted to changing climates, survived environmental crises, and passed genetic traits from one generation to the next. Most of those people left no written records. Many left few archaeological traces. Yet their descendants inherited the consequences of their lives. Modern genetics allows researchers to glimpse fragments of those forgotten journeys. Every genetic marker carries information about ancestry. Every population contains echoes of ancient events. The Rh factor is one of countless clues embedded within the human genome. What makes it special is not that it proves extraordinary theories. What makes it special is that it captured public imagination and encouraged people to ask deeper questions. Those questions matter. They lead toward a broader understanding of humanity's shared past. The story of Rh-negative blood ultimately becomes a story about survival. Small populations surviving ice ages, communities enduring isolation, families carrying inherited traits across thousands of years, generations adapting to landscapes that no longer exist. The farther researchers look into prehistory, the more remarkable this continuity appears. Human history is not merely a record of kings and empires. It is a record of inheritance, a record of movement, a record of persistence. Every living person represents an unbroken chain extending back through countless ancestors. Most of their names are forgotten. Most of their stories vanished long ago. Yet traces of their existence remain inside the bodies of their descendants. That reality is astonishing. It means that ancient migrations still influence modern genetics. Ice Age survivors still shape contemporary populations. Events that occurred thousands of years ago continue leaving subtle marks on the present. Rh-negative blood is one example. Not evidence of a lost world, but evidence that the past never completely disappears. The DNA revolution reinforced this lesson repeatedly. Again and again, researchers discovered that ancient history was more interconnected than expected. Populations thought separate, often shared ancestry. Regions assumed isolated, revealed hidden connections. The deeper the investigation went, the more complicated the story became. Complexity replaced simplicity. Evidence replaced assumption. Yet mystery remained. Not the mystery of Atlantis. Not the mystery of supernatural bloodlines. A deeper mystery. The mystery of how much remains unknown. Ancient DNA has transformed understanding of human history, but it has not completed the picture. New discoveries appear every year. Previously unknown migrations emerge from genetic data. Archaeological finds challenge existing interpretations. Entire chapters of prehistory continue being rewritten. The process is ongoing. Future researchers will almost certainly know things that seem unimaginable today. New evidence will appear. New questions will arise. Some current assumptions may change. Others will strengthen. This is how knowledge advances, not through final answers but through continual refinement. And perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden within the RH negative mystery. The world is not divided neatly into mysteries and solutions. Instead, every answer reveals additional layers. Every discovery opens new doors. Every clue leads farther into the past. The mystery persists not because it cannot be explained, but because human history itself is vast beyond comprehension. A single blood type became a reminder of that vastness. A reminder that the story of humanity stretches far beyond recorded memory. A reminder that beneath every modern population lies an ocean of forgotten generations. And a reminder that even the smallest biological detail can connect us to journeys that began thousands of years before the first cities rose from the earth. Word count 1154. The mystery, in the end, becomes quieter. It begins with questions about unusual blood and extraordinary origins. It ends with a wider view of time itself. Across mountains, coastlines, forests, deserts, and vanished plains, generations come and go, entire cultures appear, flourish, and disappear. Languages emerge, evolve, and fade into silence. Shorelines move, rivers change course, ice advances and retreats. The world that shaped our ancestors is often almost unrecognizable today. Yet something remains, not always monuments, not always stories, sometimes only traces, a fragment of DNA, a buried skeleton, a forgotten settlement beneath layers of earth, or a small genetic variation carried forward through thousands of years. Arch-negative blood is one such trace. It reminds us that history is not confined to books or ruins. Part of it travels within living people, part of it survives in inheritance. The past is not entirely behind us. In subtle ways, it continues moving through the present. The search for hidden origins often leads people toward dramatic explanations. Lost continents, vanished empires, secret lineages, and forgotten rulers offer powerful stories. They satisfy a longing to believe that extraordinary answers wait just beyond the horizon. Sometimes the truth is different. Sometimes the truth is that ordinary human lives, repeated across immense stretches of time, create outcomes so complex that they appear mysterious. A family survives a harsh winter. A community endures a changing climate. A population remains in one region while others move away. Generation follows generation. The consequences accumulate. Thousands of years later, scientists detect the result. There is something beautiful in that realization. The greatest story may not be about a civilization that vanished overnight. It may be about countless people whose names are lost, whose struggles are forgotten, and whose choices quietly shape the future. As evening settles over ancient coastlines now submerged beneath the sea, As winds move across mountains that watched the Ice Age end, and as rivers continue flowing past landscapes inhabited since prehistory, the human story remains unfinished. New discoveries will come, new mysteries will emerge, and somewhere within the endless record of time, more clues still wait to be found. For now, the question of Rh-negative blood rests where many enduring mysteries ultimately rest, not in certainty, but in the space between what is known and what is still being uncovered. A small clue, a long journey, a reminder that humanity's past is far deeper, stranger, and more interconnected than it first appears,